पार्थाय प्रतिबोधितां भगवता नारायणेन स्वयं व्यासेन ग्रथितां पुराणमुनिना मध्ये महाभारतम् अद्वैतामृतवर्षिणीं भगवतीम् अष्टादशाध्यायिनीम् अम्ब त्वामनुसन्दधामि भगवद्गीते भवद्वेषिणीम् यं ब्रह्मा वरुणेन्द्ररुद्रमरुतस्तुन्यन्ति दिव्यैस्तवैः वेदैः साङ्ख्यपदक्रमोपनिषदैः गायन्ति यं सामगाः ध्यानावस्थिततद्गतेन मनसा पश्यन्ति यं योगिनो यस्यान्तं न विदुःसुरासुरगणाः देवाय तस्मै नमः. We are continuing our discussion on the 6th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, that is Dhyana Yoga or Yoga of Meditation. In the last few sessions, we were discussing certain very important vital points about how our own accumulated tendencies, impressions, and impulses influence our actions, determine and define our behavior, and so on. Now, Lord Krishna speaks about 3 types of spiritual seekers who may not fully succeed in achieving their spiritual goal, and that is the subject that opens, that unfolds from Arjuna's question. The question is, ayadi shraddhayopedo yoga chalidamanasaha aprapya yoga samsiddhim kam gatim krishna gacchati. It's a big question actually. As I mentioned earlier, what happens to those who take to spiritual life? We may spend a long time in meditation. We may spend a long time in prayers, reading scriptures, and perhaps even in karma yoga. We think by going to a church or a temple or any place of worship, and if we do service there, it can help us. And we sometimes assume that these activities will produce immediate tangible results. That's one problem in spiritual life which we should all keep in mind. That is, in normal activities, when we do something, we can normally expect a result, a tangible, visible result, in a very short time. That's what, see, if you invest money in business, you get profits. If you work hard, you may get a promotion or you may get a high grade in the examinations. And you may be able to attain a lot of things. So there is a connecting link between what we do and the expected results or consequences. Now, when we apply this principle in spiritual life, sometimes we actually fail to understand the main distinction between spiritual life and life that we normally live in this world. In spiritual life, the results may not be there in visible form in front of us all the time. But there are results. These results are never lost. In fact, any spiritual practice will produce some result. Even the ritualistic practices will produce some good results. It's called Apoorvam. When you perform a Vedic ritual, that performance of the ritual will produce an immediate result, and it is called Adhrishtam. Adhrishtam means the invisible. It's not seen, but it is there. It is deposited in our internal system, in our mental system. So it is called Adhrishtam. And it is called Apoorvam, another word, which means it did not exist before you performed that good action. This is true in our everyday activity also. Now the point is, this result may not be there in visible form as maybe the results in business. When you invest money in business, when you are taking proper care of your investment, you can certainly expect the results, the profits, the money returns in a different form. Maybe it will multiply, it may increase. But in spiritual life, this may not be always visible, but it is there. So Lord Krishna analyzes this problem from three different angles. He classifies them into three categories. One is, at the lowest level, is the highly confused people, highly deluded kind of people, who have done a lot of things, but suddenly there is a deviation. You may call it a fall, and then the person may die before he got enough time to do penance for some of his misdoings, and sometimes we wrongly conclude that his whole life was a waste, which it is not. The lowest category called Vimudha, the highly deluded. There is another group of spiritual seekers who are slightly higher in terms of spiritual evolution. They are called ārurukṣhoḥ, means those who are desirous of entering the path of yoga. Yoga here means the path of meditation, the path of spiritual contemplation, the serious spiritual life as a whole. Those who are desirous, there's a strong desire to start a spiritual life. It's called ārurukṣhoḥ, the second category. And there are those who belong to a much higher category. It's called ārūḍha, means those who have already entered the path of spiritual life. Ārūḍha means somebody who has climbed the ladder of spiritual life. Means those who have already started the journey. Now Lord Krishna says, those who are highly deluded could not make much progress in this life. Their spiritual activities will not be lost. They'll be born in their next life, they'll be born in a family where at different stages of his or her life, the past samskaras, impressions, will start unfolding. So you may have come across people like that. Sometimes in family, some youngsters living sometimes maybe somewhat indisciplined during the early years. And then when they reach the middle age or even before that, suddenly happen to read a book, happen to associate with some spiritual persons, be visiting a holy place, some kind of connection, some kind of association that will suddenly spring up the spiritual fountain. So Sri Ramakrishna talks about such people. You are digging a well, and you go on digging, no water. Suddenly your hammer hits a stone, a rock, and immediately a fountain bursts forth. This could happen. This could of course happen even to higher spiritual persons also. According to some schools of this Vedic astrology. Remember, we are not talking about astrology. I'm the last person to make astrology the topic for a conversation. I'm the last person. But I neither believe nor disbelieve. I don't dismiss this as something absolutely superstitious, but I'm not at all an exponent of astrology. But that there is a logic in their science. But they say if people start unfolding their characteristics from previous life cycles, maybe when they're 5 years old, 12 years old, 16 years old, 21 years old, after 30 years, sometimes even after 50 years, sometimes even after 60 or 70 years. It could happen. What happens? Just like a layer, lake. Suppose there are different. There's a huge layer of unpleasant samskaras on the top layer of the lake. So our mind is like a lake. We call chittam is like a lake. It is a huge repository of samskaras, impressions, attitudes from previous life cycles. On the top layers is all undesirable things, Sometimes bacteria, weeds, undesirable growth and all that. But beneath there is pure water. Sometimes the pure water may come to the surface only when a person has reached 70th year, 60th year, 50th year. It could happen. That's why you find suddenly people undergoing these transformations. In fact, many of the Christian mystics, including Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Augustine, even Saint Paul, he was not a born saint. But remember, it doesn't mean that everyone should have a past. That Vedanta doesn't endorse that view. Every saint has a past, in the sense, not such a saintly past. There are very great people who are born saints, like Shankaracharya. A little boy of 3 years old, he had mastered all the scriptures, and whatever we read in Shankaracharya's works, the profound philosophy, he had already mastered when he was just 3 years old. And Sri Ramakrishna had the highest samadhi experience when he was 5 years old. So there have been great men. Christ himself, when he was a 12-year-old boy, he was found discussing higher philosophy and theology with the elders in the synagogue. So you can find such things happening in the lives of great men, no doubt. But still, in some cases, these earlier tendencies may start unfolding at later stages. It's called Vimudha. Then it's called ārurukṣhoḥ, those who want to enter the path of spiritual life. Lord Krishna says, they are born in families. Suchiyam simatam gehe yoga bhrashtaha upajayate. Yoga bhrashta means those who had deviation from the path of spiritual life. They are born in the next life, they are born in a family where the parents, the family will be affluent because they passed away in their previous life with some unfulfilled desires. So they have to fulfill that desire. So there will be enough means, enough wealth, so that they can fulfill their unfulfilled desires. So Suchinam Simatam Gehi. But the families, the circumstances will be conducive to spiritual life. And the highest, those who have advanced a lot in their previous life, they are born in families of ascetics, and they will have a natural momentum pushing them behind. Now, remember, it doesn't mean, we should never get away with the conclusion that it all depends upon pedigree or family background. Not at all. Vedanta, Buddhism and Yoga philosophy. Generally speaking, most of the Oriental religious traditions do believe that every jiva, every soul is a solitary traveler. You don't continue taking place, being born in the same family generation after generation. It doesn't happen. Sometimes you find in the family of great saintly persons, a very saintly person may be born. In the family of people who are not well known for any saintly qualities, a great saint may be born. As you mentioned, in the last session we discussed Prahlada. So Lord Krishna in the Gita itself says, among the demons, I am Prahlada. Prahlada, noblest specimen, means the highest devotee. He was right from his birth, as an infant, he was chanting the name of God. He was meditating and praying right from his infancy. That too, he was actually persecuted by his own parents, and all his colleagues and his friends used to torture him and torment him for taking the name of God. Still the little boy continued living the life of a great saint and a devotee, and Sri Ramakrishna himself pays compliments to Prahlada. So there are such exceptions also. Now, one important point that Lord Krishna makes clear, and the verse is very, very important, I think, Kachinno bhayavibrashta chinna brahmanasyadi apradishto mahabaho vimudho brahmanapadi. This is actually, this is is an extension of Arjuna's question. Arjuna is continuing his question. He expands the idea that he wants to get cleared by Lord Krishna. He says, what about Vimudha? I mean those who are completely gone astray. What happens to them? Then ārurukṣhoḥ, then ārūḍha. Now Lord Krishna says something very important. He says, Jignasu. Who is a Jignasu? Purvabhyasena tenaiva hridesi avashopi sakha Jignasu rabhiyogasya shabda brahma adivartate. It is a very well-known verse. That verse is 44th verse. Purvabhyasena tenaiva hridesi avashopi sakha Jignasu rabhiyogasya shabda brahma adivartate. Jignasu is a person who wants to know. Jnādum ichcha, jignāsa. Jignāsa means a strong desire to know God or to know higher spiritual truths. Such a person is called Jignasu. So Lord Krishna says, a serious inquirer, a serious investigator, somebody who in the midst of his routine of daily life, his obligations and duties and professional responsibilities, one day he comes back to his home and sits well. What's the meaning of all this? Every day I'm working 15 hours, and of course once a week I'm going to the temple, I'm paying something to the priest, I'm getting some rituals done, I'm doing some service mechanically as a routine. Okay, now there are certain people who sometimes start thinking, where am I going? Am I making any progress? What's the ultimate goal of life? It takes a lot of spiritual courage to pause for some time and think and take stock of the past life and ask this question to oneself. To face this question that's coming from your own mind. Where am I going? What's the meaning of human existence? Such a person is called a Jignasu. That means he's actually beginning his spiritual journey. He's boarding the bus. He's starting his journey. Now this happens as a result of cultural, intellectual evolution. Thinking about higher life, beginning of spiritual journey. Such a person is called a Jignasu. And Lord Krishna says, such a person is far superior to a person who mechanically continues living and practicing certain do's and don'ts. I shall fast on a particular day, I shall go to temple on a particular day, and this I will do, this I will not do. So what happens? It could happen that you may get stuck somewhere. But remember, that is the beginning. You have to begin your education in the kindergarten, no doubt, or the primary school after some years. Without going through these early stages, you cannot reach the university. You cannot straight away go to the university. You have to begin with the school, with the kindergarten. But you should not stop there. So, when you start asking this question, asking for a meaning of these rituals, higher ideas, then you are a Jignasu, you are an experimenter, you are trying to experiment, you are trying to go deeper, you are trying to investigate into the mysteries of human life and spirituality. Such a person is far superior to a person who mechanically follows a path. Now, these descriptions are helpful because these verses, coming to the end of the 6th chapter, which is a very important chapter, which actually describes the dynamics of what life means for yoga, it actually helps us to avoid certain problems that can be avoided. One problem is we all think that we can immediately start our spiritual life with the highest, entering the spiritual path at the highest stage. It is not possible. When we read scriptures, we think, I would rather be a jnani rather than a yogi, because jnani seems to be a very wonderful, superior person. So I would rather be a jnani. And somebody know you are inferior, you can do bhakti. So it is not our own choice. It all depends upon what we have been doing in our previous life. That's a very important point. That's why Hriyadeshi avashopisaha. Avasho means you're helpless. The momentum, the force of accumulated samskaras, the momentum, the force of inherited accumulated samskaras and vasanas will push you in one direction. We may try to explain this away. Well, I'm born with such a tendency. Well, that tendency has a logical explanation. It has got a background. That tendency comes from certain actions which produce those tendencies, not in this life, in previous life. If we can keep this in mind, then we can actually avoid many problems which are avoided, which can be avoided. And we can get an idea of why and how I think and act and speak and behave in a particular manner. You will be able to understand, you will be able to make an idea of the dynamics of the world of human emotions and feelings. We will know it's coming from another source. I have no choice in this matter. I do have a choice. I can do more good things. I can do more spiritual practices in this life. That will help me to improve my future and to go ahead in spiritual life more rapidly. But it is important that we should be able to get an idea of our own samskaras, our own mind. So this is how we are able to detect the influence of our own samskaras, our own ego system on our character or behavior. So this is an important point, remember. I shall conclude the description, the discussion of the 44th verse with an analogy, which is a parable. There are many parables in Hindu scriptures, but I shall just, some of them I have already discussed on various platforms, on various occasions, but some of them may be new. So the 44th verse we should remember, Purabhyasena tenaiva hriyade hi avashopisaha. Because by the force of our own actions, our own tendencies that we have accumulated by actions in previous life cycles, we are helplessly being pushed forward into the spiritual life or into further actions. But important point to remember, if we can stop for some time, jijnasu, if we can become a jijnasu, means if we can start thinking seriously of the real meaning and implications of spiritual life, then we are actually boarding the bus. We are beginning our spiritual life. And of course there are many parables and stories, some of them very illustrative. There is the story of Ajamila. Ajamila is a Ajamila Upakhyanam. You find the Bhagavad Purana. He was a young man who led a very disciplined life. His parents brought him up very well. But after he became a full-fledged young man, he had a deviation in his life and he became indisciplined. That's the least thing to say about it. And he started living a wayward life, and he did all that no gentleman will do and did nothing that a gentleman should do. That's enough. The story is so bleak and so dark. But now it was time for him to leave the world. He had become very old and he had himself ill-treated his parents and living alone in undesirable companies who also left him. And then it was about time for him to die. He had become old, weak and helpless. In his total helplessness, he thought of calling his own son, and his son happened to have the same name as that of Lord Vishnu, Narayana. That's the name. Naranam Ayanam Yasya Sagamin, Naranam Ayanam, that the spiritual destination of all human beings. That's the real meaning, Vishnu. It's a synonym of Vishnu. So that was the name that he had given to his own son. So he called his son to his side. But as he called out his son's name, immediately he remembered that when he was a young man, he was reciting the same holy name, in a synonym of Vishnu, and immediately his mind went to God, to Vishnu, and immediately Vishnu's messengers came and took him to Vishnu Loka. That's the story. That's one thing. Now, the reason this story is very important is that he had done a lot of spiritual practices in his early life, and at the end of his life, though he did not continue his spiritual life, he had a deviation. Still, at the end of his life, when he had become totally helpless, suddenly he happened to call his son, and he didn't want to call the name of Vishnu Narayana, but he wanted to call his son, but his son's name happened to be Vishnu. So that coincidence led his mind to the thought of God himself. That led to his spiritual liberation. That's how the story goes. There are different versions of the story and the commentaries, Another very much more graphic example can be found in the story of Jadabharata, which I have narrated on many occasions on this platform in earlier lectures. Now, in ancient days, there is a practice for people who have become too old, including kings and emperors, to retire after they have seen the face of the grandson or granddaughter. They should retire to a forest and live the rest of their lifetime in meditation and contemplation. Grihasthasya yada pasye vali palidam atmanaga apatyasya apatyam tada aranyam samasya. You find in this verse in the Manusmriti. See, according to this tradition, when you see the face of your grandson or granddaughter, when your face becomes wrinkled, or when your hair grows grey, then you should retire to a forest hermitage and spend the rest of your lifetime in contemplation and meditation on God. This idea. So he retired. His name was Bharata. The king's name was Bharata. So he became very old. He made his eldest son was declared as his successor, and he retired to forest hermitage, and he built a small hut, a hermitage on the banks of a river, and he started living a contemplative life, meditating and contemplating on God and spiritual ideas. Now, one day it so happened that in front of him, as I mentioned, there was a river, a stream, and a female deer was being chased by a lion, and as the female deer jumped across the stream, because it was pregnant, it gave birth to a baby deer, and the mother deer died. And so the baby deer fell into the stream, and the king plunged the river, saved the little baby deer and brought him up in his hermitage. He was a very compassionate person, very kind-hearted person. It's a marvelous example of, compassion to animals. Now, in course of time, this little baby deer, he grew up in the forest hermitage. And it so happened, the king was a very compassionate person, but something went wrong with him. What happened, he started neglecting his spiritual disciplines. He had given up his own kingdom. He had given up his own children, his own responsibilities, royal responsibilities, and he had retired to forest hermitage to live the rest of his lifetime as a hermit, spending his time in meditation and contemplation. But what happened, he started thinking upon this little deer as little kid and spent all his lifetime on feeding the little animal, saving it from wild animals. Like lions and tigers will come and chase, so he saved the little animal from these wild animals. So what happened, he started neglecting his own meditation, his own prayers, his own spiritual disciplines. So what happened, he started thinking only about the safety of the animal instead of thinking of God. An ideal king he should have, if he were an ideal saint, hermit, he should have continued his spiritual practices undisturbed by the presence of the little animal. But he became so attached, he started thinking that he is the only custodian of this animal. So what happened, when he died, he was born as a deer. Because the samskaras that his mind was focused on, that influenced his next life. So he was born as a deer. Now what happened, when he was born again, this little deer, who was the great king, the great hermit, Jadabharata in previous life, there was something special about that animal. It will live only within the precincts of the hermitage. It won't go out. It won't mix with other animals. It won't have anything to do with other animals. It will stay only within the precincts of the hermitage and will eat the grass, and it died. What happened? This deer was the Jadabharata. When it died, the animal could think of God when it died. So even the deer did not lose the previous samskaras, because he was a great king, Bharata, who left his kingdom behind and became a hermit, an ascetic, but who was a very compassionate person. But again his mind was diverted. But still, his great spiritual disciplines, his sacrifices did not go in vain. So what happened? When the deer died, he was born as a great spiritual person, as a saint. But he pretended to be dumb. He won't speak to anybody. He will not mix with anybody. So his own brothers and relatives mistook him for a dumb man. One day, and they actually took away his property and drove him away from his family. This man didn't bother, because he was the great devotee, he was the great saint, the great philosopher, the great King Bharata in 2 life cycles earlier. What happened? One day, a king was being taken on a palanquin. So the palanquin bearers found this healthy youngster who looked very dumb but very healthy. They asked him, "You come on, you help us in bearing this palanquin." And this man agreed. Okay, he didn't bother. He was a great philosopher. So you can think a little bit of this uniqueness of a man with his mind on something transcendental. You can see a little bit of this. among the early Greek philosophers. If you read the life of Socrates, if you read lives of Diogenes, you can get a bit of this ancient Indian ideal of keeping the mind on something transcendental, something higher all the time. So this man, he came to be known as Jada Bharata, because Jada means dumb. Bharata was his name. So he started bearing this palanquin. So the palanquin was not properly being borne. It was jerking all the time, shaking all the time. The king Raghugana was the one. He was the king who was traveling in the palanquin. So he asked, "What's the matter with you, young man? You are not bearing this palanquin properly." Then the man, the Jadabharata, put a counter question. The question revealed the fact this man was a great saint and philosopher. There's a long dialogue between King Raghugana and Jadabharata. So what it means is, the story simply, it's a very interesting analogy. What it means is, whatever we do, we don't lose. We are born again. Whatever little spiritual practice we do, that will add little, it's like putting some money in our bank account, spiritual bank account. And whether you like it or not, you will get a checkbook and fountain pen when you are born again, and that is your inheritance, spiritual inheritance. So that is the 44th verse. This idea is again extended further, 45th verse, which we are not going to discuss in detail because it's also very important. Prayatnat yatamanastu yogi samshuddha gilbishaka anega janma samsiddhas tato yadi paramkatim. But it means is, this yogi, this man of meditation, this contemplative person, this spiritual person, he works, he strives with great tenacity, assiduously, and becomes completely purified. His mind becomes completely purified of all taint, and gradually he becomes perfect, evolving from life cycle to life cycle, and eventually reaches the highest good. He attains highest goods. The 46th verse is very, very important from the standpoint of the context. That is, tapasibhyo adhigo yogi jnanibhyo pi matodhidha karmibhya adhigo yogi tasmad yogi bhava Arjuna. So tapasibhya adhikaha yogi jnanibhya api mataha adhikaha. What it means is, the yogi is superior to tapasvis. Tapasvis means those who practice extreme asceticism. And a yogi is superior to those who are just scholars. Because you find there are many philosophers, academic philosophers, who write books, good or bad, interpreting what they consider to be the best idea, best message of Vedanta. I have come across many who, I heard of professors of philosophy in India who teach Brahma Sutra Bhashya, will also tell you absolute gibberish. That statement also they will make in academic institutions in India. I've seen those who do not believe in what they teach. So they know a lot of lot about the scripture, the meaning of the words. Such people are called jnani. The word jnani in this verse doesn't mean a man or a woman who has attained spiritual wisdom. That's a normal meaning of the word jnani. Somebody who has got spiritual knowledge. But here it means just intellectual understanding, just intellectual knowledge, which Sri Ramakrishna or Shankaracharya did not take very seriously. Shabdajalam maharanyam chitta brahmanakaranam. That is what Shankaracharya says. Shabdajalam is the world of words. Maharan is a big forest. It can only serve you to go mad. It can only make you crazy. That's the only advantage of this kind of verbosity. If you understand something and out of that you feel a kind of inner tranquility, peace and contentment, then that intellectual knowledge has some relevance and meaningfulness. But if it confuses you, chitta brahmana karanam, that is how Shankaracharya calls it. This kind of mutually contradicting views and different philosophical doctrines which do not present before you a higher ideal for you to follow and practice in your life, but this presents a set of mutually conflicting and mutually contradictory ideas and teachings. That kind of knowledge can only create confusion in our mind. So Shankaracharya calls it Shabdajalam Maharanyam Chitta Brahmana Karanam. It's only just, it becomes a cause for our confusion. Mind becomes more and more perplexed. So yoga is far superior to that kind of knowledge. Mere verbosity. And of course tapas I mentioned, we are going to describe it again. And it is also certainly far superior to the ritualistic philosophy of Vedas, which just lays down before you a set of do's and don'ts. Now let us discuss this verse again. Yogi, that is a person, that is a man or woman who is practicing meditation, who is seriously concerned with spiritual life. So what's the meaning of yogi here? Yogi can be defined as a person who meditates, who takes spiritual life seriously, who looks for a meaning and essence behind all these external teachings, and who tries to practice and realize the teachings. Such a person is called a yogi. Such a yogi is superior to tapasvibhya, means ascetics. Asceticism is tapas. You find there are different kinds of ascetic practices. In Sanskrit it's called sharirigam, vachigam, manasigam. It means physical austerities, physical asceticism. Purity, inner purity, outer purity, and then certain ritualistic practices, yamas, niyamas, pranayama, pratyahara, etc. Remember, Gita is not saying that this is not necessary or anything. What it says is, yogi already has acquired all these qualities. The yogi has already gone through these different stages of acquiring spiritual qualities. That's why yogi becomes greater than tapasvi. So, physical level, then at the verbal level, vachika tapas. It means you speaking the truth, speaking properly without hurting others. Now remember, a yogi is a person for whom truthfulness has become his nature. So he doesn't have to pay special attention to sticking to truth, because he cannot and will not speak untruth or falsehood. So that's the idea behind it. You don't have to tell a professor of mathematics, when you calculate 2 plus 2, remember it is 4. You don't have to tell him, because he knows that. He doesn't make a mistake when he multiplies numbers, because he has already studied during his early part of a spiritual evolution. So that's the idea. That is called sharirika, physical austerities, ascetic practices, and verbal, speaking the truth, speaking in a way that you don't hurt others and you don't create confusion among people. That is verbal asceticism. The third one is, mental, manasikam, means ahimsa, satya, steya, brahmacharya, parigraha, all these. Shama, yama, niyamas are examples of manasika, mean mental disciplines. You already acquired all this. That's why a yogi is considered to be superior. His position is higher than the position of a tapasvi, an ascetic. Then jnanibhyaka, he is certainly greater than professional academic philosophers. Remember, it's not that a professional philosopher wrong or anything. What it means, a Christ is certainly greater than just a theologian who has got a PhD from a divinity school. So, how do you understand that? Christ is certainly greater than just somebody who has got a PhD from a divinity school. Something like that. I'm just giving a parallel, an example, a metaphor. Like that, those who have studied books, those who can expound philosophical ideas, scriptures, don't bother about giving any more significance to that, not practicing it, but just academically understanding and expounding the teachings of scripture. Yogi is greater than jnani. That's meaning in which the word jnani is used in this 46th verse of the 6th chapter. Otherwise there will be misunderstanding. Then karmibhyaka. The karmi here means those who follow the do's and don'ts. It's called vidhi nishethas. So you find in the Purva Kanda, in the Mimamsa philosophy of Vedic tradition, Vedic ritualism, there are certain do's and don'ts. You should do certain things, you should not do certain things. When you perform these Vedic rituals, there are strict do's and don'ts. So if every morning and every evening you should perform what you call sandhyavandana, ablutions. If you practice them, you don't get any special benefit, but if you skip them for some reason, then you have to do penance for it. So you have to do twice, or you may do extra like that. So such rituals, remember, they do have a place. Rituals are not without any meaning. Scriptural study also has a great significance in spiritual life. Ascetic practices also have their significance. The point is, we should not stop there. We should go beyond that. So, as we practice do's and don'ts, as we practice asceticism, every genuine spiritual seeker will one day sit and think and pause for some time. Well, what should I do next? What's the meaning of what I've been doing all these years? We should not do that immediately after starting. After practicing certain disciplines for some years, when we do that sincerely, as a part of our natural evolution, without making any special effort for that, one day you will start thinking, if you are sincere in our spiritual practices, we will start thinking, well, am I making real progress? Am I doing things the right way? This is the stage when you actually board the bus. This is the stage when you actually start a spiritual life. But without and before practicing certain disciplines for some years, you cannot genuinely ask this question. There are people who will ask the question even without listening to one word. That is, of course, meaningless. But genuine inquisitiveness comes only after we have traveled some distance To be able to ask the right question, we should know a little bit of what we are studying. We cannot start our inquiry in a vacuum. So that stage is called the jijnasu, and yogi is a person who has already transcended that stage and who has reached his goal, and he is looking for the real meaning of life. Such a person is far superior to those who are mechanically practicing or doing ascetic practices. I will fast on a particular day, on 21 days fasting, or I will do 5 days fasting, then I will read scripture for half an hour every day. Sometimes the point is, do's and don'ts, routine mechanical practices can become a prison. It could happen. So, I have heard of the story among the Mimamsakas, Indian ritualistic schools. There's a funny story that's being narrated in many of these discussions. So, in ancient time, there was a great ritualist who he was practicing some Vedic rituals, some kind of fire sacrifice or whatever it is. So, he had a cat in his home, and he used to disturb the whole household, moving about all over the place when he was practicing these rituals in the morning. So what he did then he decided to tie this cat to a nearby tree during the time when he was doing his ablutions or prayers or meditation or puja or something. So in course of time, after his death, his son thought that catching a cat and tying it to a tree is part of the ritual. Now, actually, you can see this is how sometimes a mechanical practice can become a meaningless ritual, and it can become a prison house. Sometimes, I should do japa, I should pray only on a particular day, particular time, otherwise God will be unhappy. Well, that kind of practice, that kind of discipline is necessary. If a little kindergarten child, when he returns to kindergarten, mother may ask him, you should practice your arithmetic or whatever you have studied alphabet, you should practice in your home, you should write 5 times, something like that. Grandmother or mother affectionately will tell the little boy or child, little girl, you should write this alphabet 5 times. But you don't tell the same thing when that person becomes a professor. He doesn't have to write alphabet 5 times. So what happens, rituals can sometimes become prisons. It can keep us bound to a particular stage and can prevent us from growing further. So that's why karmibhyaha means those who are just followers of rituals. The yogi is far superior to those who follow these blind rituals. That's the idea behind it. We will continue this discussion, and we'll finish this chapter, the next session, and we can have interactions, questions and answers. Most welcome. Yeah.
Perhaps, Swamiji, I can ask you a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear.
So, Swamiji, in Viveka Chudamani, Shankaracharya talks about the 3 rare gifts. So, a seeker who is endowed with those 3 rare gifts that he talks about, in which category would you place him, and how should he or she approach his life in the context of Lord Krishna's instructions?
But could you repeat again 3 ways?
Or the 3 gifts that you have: human birth, you have holy company, and you have mumukshutvam.
Yeah. This is general. Durlabham trayamevaidat daivanugraha kedugam manushyutvam mumukshutvam mahapurusha samsayaka. So being born as a human being, and then association with spiritual seekers, and a strong urge for spiritual enlightenment. All these three qualities are equally important, if you have got mumukshutvam, if you have a strong desire for making progress in spiritual life, then all other qualifications will come automatically. So this idea has been removed. So manushyatvam, of course, obvious. Human beings, only human beings can think of higher life. Mumukshutvam, that is a strong desire for liberation. When that is very strong, then naturally we will have a desire to look for people from whom we can learn about this spiritual life, spiritual liberation. The Mahapurusha Samsaya will automatically come, because we will be looking for the right kind of persons to associate with. That will naturally reinforce our own spiritual characteristics. Yes, behind. Yeah.
There's a question on YouTube from Mark Goodrich.
Yeah.
How can I make my mind my friend?
Yeah. Yeah. The question is how to make our mind our friend. Normally, our mind doesn't cooperate when we try to do something that we know is good for us. So that conflict is sometimes, that's an indication that our mind is not always our best friend. So the tendency of the mind to not cooperate with our will, our noble intentions, is due to certain negative tendencies that are already accumulated in the mental system. So we can counteract the influence of negative tendencies by producing a surplus of positive tendencies. As I mentioned frequently, feeding the mind with good food, with good ideas, which become good samskaras. So again, association with spiritual persons, not necessarily in-person association, but reading. When we read a spiritual book, we are actually associating with great men and women, great spiritual men and spiritual women. So that's one way of feeding our mind with good tendencies and doing good things. Any good activity, physical activity, verbal activity, intellectual activity, all these can produce some invisible mental food, and that it's called in the form of vrittis, vasanas, samskaras, which we call in Sanskrit. So they can reinforce the good tendencies which are already accumulated in the mental system. And when we are able to increase the store of good tendencies, the mind will slowly begin to cooperate with us. So when we want to do something that we know is good for us, if our mind is fully ready to cooperate, then we feel great enthusiasm, great energy, and great inner contentment when our mind is fully in friendly terms with us. The only way to do that is by doing good actions, mentally, verbally, and physically. if you don't have questions, then I have some announcements to make. That is, the next 2 weeks there will be no class, because on Friday 25th and January 1st, on 25th we have Christmas, and January 1st we have the big event, puja and reading, a short talk, Holy Mother's puja celebrations, and what we normally celebrate here, Kalpataru Day, January 1st is an important event. So you are all most welcome. Please remember Holy Mother Sri Shraddha Devi's birthday celebration and New Year's Day celebration, Friday, January the 1st, 10 a.m. So the worship begins at 10 a.m. the new temple, and the puja and worship will be live streamed on our YouTube channel and our live stream channel. So you are most welcome to watch the event, puja and worship celebration, January 1st, Friday. It begins at 10 a.m. in the morning. It will be over before 2 o'clock. Before 1:30 there will be music, devotional music, and there will be reading from scriptures. Unfortunately, due to this COVID and pandemic, we are not able to hold this program as elaborately as we do every year, but it will be live streamed and will be available on YouTube channel and live stream channel. So please remember, there will be no Bhagavad Gita classes for the next 2 weeks, that is December 25th due to Christmas and January 1st due to the puja celebration. That means the next Gita class, Bhagavad Gita class, will be on January the 8th, Friday at 7:30 a.m. 7:30 p.m. in the evening. So the next class will be on January 8th, Friday, 7:30 p.m. as usual, same time. Thank you, namaskar, and expect all of you will attend this puja celebration. And also we have Christmas celebration, of course. We have Christmas celebration. We will have a short talk on Christmas at 11 a.m. in the morning, and we will have celebrations. You can please see our website and you get details. Thank you.